This abandonment of the 50-state strategy contributed to it. And this year, you guys want to hear something crazy, I got to show you this. So this year, and this is from Ballotopedia, this is an elections breakdown of elections within the state. This analysis includes offices at levels of the government, excluding the presidency. In 2024, 78% of the 2,845 law enforcement elections Ballotopedia covered were uncontested, one of the highest uncontested rates among any office type.
Hey, it's Jordan. I am in Flint, Michigan, East Palestine, Ohio,
Tumwa, Iowa.
Please support the only independent outlet on the ground covering what the corporate media covers up.
In an interview yesterday with leftist Twitch streamer Hassanabi at the In the Oligarchy rally in Nevada, Senator Bernie Sanders suggested one of the solutions to feckless Democrats is for independents to run against them in upcoming elections.
What my view is people should think about running as they want. Progressive independents should run as progressive Democrats, but don't necessarily feel that you have to run within the Democratic Party. And I think as you may recall, in Nebraska, a fellow named Dan Osborne ran a really, really powerful campaign as an independent, running as a very proud trade unionist, running on economic issues, and he did extremely well, much better than anyone had anticipated. So that was my point, and I think it makes sense.
Despite being registered as an independent himself, Bernie has been kind of sticking to his guns on support for the Democratic Party. He endorsed Joe Biden in 2024. He endorsed him in 2020. He's endorsed many Democratic Party incumbents, not just insurgent candidates from groups like Justice Democrats, not just people like AOC, but he's endorsed the party. He's towed the party line on a lot of things that, got some people that supported him a little upset. However, this seems to be a change in tune as to what he has done in the past. Now, in 2018, 2020, he did endorse many non-corporate candidates. He founded the organization in 2017, Our Revolution, which then switched hands to other individuals. They endorsed insurgent candidates across the country. Were set to endorse even independents, but ended up endorsing mostly Democrats, although the Democrats that they did endorse did not take corporate PAC money. However, we have seen what many call a failed strategy of reforming the Democratic Party. So let's take a look at what Bernie says here about running third party, or about running specifically independent candidates, and what does he say about third parties?
Do you feel like there's any sort of momentum to break through the duopoly in this structure as someone who has run as an independent?
It is. It's a long discussion. If you're asking me, do I think we could start a third party tomorrow? I don't, for a lot of reasons, having to do with restrictions in various states making it almost impossible. But I think what you're saying is massive discontent with both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. More and more people are looking for, I think, independent alternatives.
He's still suggesting that people run in the Democratic Party, but he's also saying there that independents, people should run independent as well, right? And one of the things that he's catching some flack over, understandably, is not mentioning that third parties exist, especially parties like the Green Party, and also not suggesting that people start a party, but on this, start a party before they run as an independent candidate. And on this aspect of starting a third party, there's actually a lot to unpack there, and I kind of agree with Bernie on the aspect of not waiting. And I'll tell you why. Part of the reason is there is a tremendous amount of barriers to starting a third party that are put into place by the duopoly, by the two major parties, to keep people off the ballot, to keep people from challenging the establishment. But there are very limited barriers for ballot access for independent candidates to run. We'll get into this a little bit. I understand people's criticisms. They are warranted with him not mentioning parties that already exist. But he also has a valid point about not waiting in order to start a party. Let's take a look here at, we're going to take a look here at ballot access requirements for political parties in the United States. There's something that you guys need to understand before we get into this. There are three things that need to happen for a candidate to run under a party ticket, or even for parties to form. The first thing is parties have to have state party recognition, state party status and access. That means every state has completely different rules of what it takes to establish a third party in that state. Every state is different. It is not, you don't just say, tomorrow I'm starting a party, you go and register with the Federal Elections Commission, and there you are, you're a party. That's not how it works. There are rules put in place, what I like to call barriers, put in place for people to start a third party. If individuals want to do that, it can take years to start a third party because of the different types of rules that are involved with starting third parties. So first, you need state party access, which will give you ballot access to actually run candidates on that ballot line. Second, you have to maintain that ballot access. So after you get it, you have to keep meeting benchmarks in order to keep that ballot access through the years. Lastly, then a candidate has to register, get the signatures, the filing fees, whatever is required for them to get access on the ballot for them to run. So first you would have to establish the party in the state. You would have to maintain that party status over time. And then candidates would have to run under that party line. And in a lot of states, you literally have to run a candidate in order to even start the party. Let's take a look at a couple of states here on Ballotopedia, and I'll show you what we're talking about. So let's take a look, and this is these are state ballot access requirements for third parties or political parties. I don't even like to say third parties because that assumes that Democrats and Republicans are the primary main parties and everything else is just secondary to them. And in our current system, that is true. However, I like the thought of this is another alternative party. But let's see what the rules are here. Let's take a look at Kentucky, for instance. Oh, well, let's take a look at Hawaii first, actually, since we're on here. Rules for Hawaii. The party must have at least 10% of votes cast statewide in a statewide office, or at least 50% of the congressional districts. So they have to run somebody and receive at least 10% of votes in that statewide office, or 50% in multiple counties in order to get state party access. The party must have received 4% of all votes cast for either state Senate office or state House offices statewide. So that's yet another barrier that's put on them. You have to receive at least 4% of votes cast for either all states or state, or for either an all state Senate office or an all state state House offices, or for all Senate offices and all state House offices. The party must have received at least 2% of all votes cast for Senate offices and state representative offices combined statewide. These are crazy barriers. That is a lot of hoops to jump through to create a party. And kudos, and I'll show you ballot access later, that the Green Party has garnered over the years, and kudos to them for receiving party status in so many states, because they do have ballot access in the majority of states, although in some states, because of the barriers, it was harder for them to garner access there. But there are many states, just like Hawaii, that their rules vary so drastically. Some of them you have to run a presidential candidate and receive 2% of the vote. Some of them you have to receive 10% in a gubernatorial race, Secretary of State race, or some other statewide race. In others, you have to pay a fee. You can file more easily as what's called a minor state party, which has more restricted ballot access in a lot of cases than major state parties. And in some states, it's easy. You just have to register. Massachusetts is one such state where it can be fairly easy to get on the ballot there. So it does vary. You can start a state party in some states easily, and then other states like Kentucky, Texas, and Hawaii have strenuous ballot access laws. Let's take a look at Kentucky here. That's my home state, and we've been trying to build third parties here for a long time, and it's very difficult. So a political party is an entity whose candidate received at least 20% of the votes cast in the most recent presidential election. Political parties must nominate their candidates via primary election. So once you become a party, you have to have a primary, but you have to get 20% of votes cast in a presidential election to be able to start a party in Kentucky. So imagine if people waited to run independent until a political party was started in Kentucky. So we'll get to what the solution is to that in a little bit, and why independence running can be beneficial. But see, these are the kind of barriers that Bernie was talking about. And that's not to discourage a third party from starting. I'm not. I don't know if he was. But I'm not trying to discourage third parties from starting. I deeply support third parties. However, we have to be realistic about what kind of barriers are in place and what kind of tactics can be used in different states and nationwide in order to garner support and actually take on the duopoly. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels in hyperbole and unicorn dreams. And the last one I wanted to take a look at was Texas, and then we can move on from this. Texas is a crazy state. Now, I was an executive director of a third party for a while, and this is why I'm so familiar with this specifically what needs to happen in every state in order to build a third party, because I reviewed rules in every state across the country to see what the different rules are. Almost all of the states, as I'd mentioned before, have difficult barriers. But Texas was one of the craziest. A person desiring to form a political party in Texas must form an organization and elect a chair and necessary officers. The organization's name cannot exceed 3 words. Okay. A political party is required to meet organizational requirements before holding its nomination conventions. A new political party is required to submit its party rules to the Secretary of State by a given date. These rules are required to prescribe the following. You have to have a parliamentary. Then you have to have meetings in every county across the state. You have to have enough people to designate delegates. And then you have to have a convention adopting the party rules. Minor parties, it's a little bit easier, but the filing dates are very limited. But to be entitled to place its nominees on the general election ballot, a third party must file a list of precinct conventions. And then the number of participants must equal 1% of the total number of votes received by a candidate for governor in the most recent gubernatorial elections. So you have to have enough people organizing with you where you get ballot signatures for at least that match at least 1% of the total number of votes received for the last gubernatorial candidate. So you have to have some pretty robust organizing there to get that done. Now, in some ways, Texas is more flexible than a lot of states, because like I showed you with Kentucky, you have to wait until the next presidential election. In some states, you have to wait until the next senatorial or gubernatorial election and garner anywhere from 2% to 10% of votes in elections, in that election, in order to be able to get party status. So that's a little overview of what it looks like to try to start a third party. And I know that sounds like a lot. I'm not trying to give a lecture, but it is important to sort of understand the framework of maybe what Bernie was talking about here, because it is in fact not, I think a lot of people have it in their mind that you just start a third party. You just claim that you're a third party and maybe file somewhere, and that's it. You have a third party. So also beware of organizations that are calling themselves a third party, and they're not telling you that they're trying to build. They're not explaining to you that they don't have ballot access. They're saying we're already a party. And, a third party is going to have to learn this as they go. People that try to start one aren't necessarily going to understand when they first start that there are a litany of 1,000 different rules that you have to follow to even start. It takes time to learn all of this and to do the organizing and to have your head wrapped around this. But it's not an instantaneous solution. It can take years and years to build a third party. So kudos to parties like the Green Party that were able to do that. Now, there's huge opportunities for independents to run and win. Let's take a look at this article really quick from Time Magazine here. And it talks about how the Democrats have lost support and registration over the last year in the last election, but over the last several years, the party has been bleeding registration and support. The Democratic Party is flailing. They lost at least 15% of their registered voters that are now registering independent. And this is something that has been happening over time steadily. I saw articles that were talking about how the Democratic Party has moved right. And that's what polls were showing. The irony is the Democratic Party is not shifting. The Democratic Party is shifting right on their policies, yes, but Democratic Party supporters are not shifting right. They're leaving the party. So all that's left are neocons that support the Democratic Party's new neocon shift. That isn't very far from 2009 GOP platforms. Kamala Harris ran on rehabilitating Dick Cheney. She ran on the most lethal military. She ran on a tougher border than Trump, tougher on the border than Trump. So Democrats are making this mistake of thinking that becoming hyper moderate, and it's not even moderate, becoming neoconservatives are going to attract neoconservatives, and that's somehow going to save their party. This is a failed strategy. They've been doing it for years. I'm going to show you that, and in part to placate their corporate donors, because they get a ton of money from corporate donors, so they don't want to move progressive or left on issues to the actual popular things like Medicare for all, tuition-free college, federal jobs guarantee, things that are extremely popular, real economic solutions. Instead, what the Democratic Party does is it tries to shift right and pick up disaffected Republicans, which I'm guessing now with what I've been seeing and what is coming from people like Hakeem Jeffries, and the leaders in the Democratic Party, is that this is going to be their strategy all over again. But now let's take a look at this article really quick. Kamala Harris may be leading Donald Trump in many national polls, but a look under the hood at Democrats' operations tells a rosy story for the party. A New Times analysis of voter registration data in 4 pivotal races finds reasons for Democrats to worry and Republicans to puff up their chest. The data suggests that Democrats in the Biden era may have frittered away advantages in states they need to win. In 4 swing states that make it easy to track political alignment in voter registrations, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, Democrats have seen their slice of the overall pie shrink. And I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. Why is their pie shrinking? Why are people leaving? Yes, the platform is absolutely part of it. There are other things at play here too, such as the abandonment of the 50-state strategy, and we'll talk about that next. It must win Pennsylvania. Democrats have their slimmest voter registration advantage in decades. In the last 4 years, Democratic registrations in the states have gone from a safe 7-point advantage to now hanging ahead by fewer than 4 points. Polling in the states show Harris leading Trump by a lonely point, while the Democratic Senate nominee runs ahead by 5. Biden carried it by just 1 percentage point in 2020. But it's worth noting, in the wake of Biden's exit, Pennsylvania Democrats saw their best week of voter registration since 2023. However, as soon as Kamala Harris started adopting that Biden policy, it dropped off. In Arizona, they lost more than 2 points. So this article goes over 5% in North Carolina. So this article goes over how the Democratic Party was just bleeding support in this election because Kamala Harris was a terrible pick. Yet you hear a lot of people out there blaming voters for Trump winning and not blaming the party that allowed it to get this way. Now, there's something crazy that happened and that has been happening across the country. The Democratic Party used to support something called the 50-state strategy. They were a very grassroots party. I'm not saying that they weren't corrupt back then. They were, but they had more FDR, working class policies. They also had very strong state houses across the country. But in the early 2000s, Democrats decided, hey man, we're going to, the late 90s to early 2000s, we're going to shift our focus to wealthy blue states where we're getting most of our donor base. And these poor states, they'll be fine. We can defund their state parties. We can kind of leave. We're going to focus on these wealthy areas. Well, for one election cycle, Howard Dean came in and decided to run the 50-state strategy again, which was highly effective, but the Democratic Party immediately knocked him down as head of the Democratic National Committee and replaced him with someone that once again shifted focus to deeply blue states that they've already taken that have a lot of money. So this abandonment of the 50-state strategy contributed to it. And this year, you guys want to hear something crazy, I got to show you this. So this year, and this is from Ballotopedia, this is an elections breakdown of elections within the state. This analysis includes offices at levels of the government, excluding the presidency. In 2024, 78% of the 2,845 law enforcement elections Ballotpedia covered were uncontested, one of the highest uncontested rates among any office type. School board races, this is good, had a lower rate at 49%. On November 5th, and let me remind you, most school boards are nonpartisan. Almost all school boards are nonpartisan. On November 5th, 2024, Ballotopedia covered 40,646 elections in 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 4 territories. Of those, 26,218, 64.5% were uncontested. And 35.5% were contested. What does uncontested mean? Nobody ran against the candidate. So no one had a choice in these elections. It was just, you get what you get, I guess. And that's whatever party has control. Their candidates are running. And I'll tell you, the majority of these uncontested seats were GOP seats, were Republican seats in quote unquote red states. So while the Democrats were promising us that they were going to help us with, anti-abortion laws, that they were going to help us with all of the things that are happening within state houses, they refused to run candidates. They didn't run candidates across the country. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is to focus on rich areas where their donors are and abandon the rest. And if you guys want to take a look at this map, we got 68% uncontested in Kentucky, 79% uncontested in Ohio. 80% of races uncontested in Michigan. Out of 15,000 races in Michigan, 80% were uncontested. And Michigan has now basically gone red. Why do you think that is? In New York, 80% uncontested. So in blue states, GOP isn't challenging as much either. But it is more alarming in the red states that there is less choice. Well, it's bad in the blue states too, because then that means that our lawmakers are just sitting there. No matter what they do, no one is contesting them, blue or red. We'll take a look at West Virginia, 65%. Let's go down to Alabama, 72%. Georgia, 74%. So I don't know if you guys remember, but Stacey Abrams did a huge registration push. They had a ton of candidates run in 2018. It was extraordinarily successful, and the Democratic Party co-opted her, but also thwarted that plan. You know why? Because a lot of non-corporate candidates were running. A lot of candidates that wasn't going to bend to the Democratic Party will. So it's more convenient for them to keep the GOP in the seats than it is for them to have anyone that's going to challenge the system. I have advised more than 100 U.S. federal races when I worked for an organization called Brand New Congress. And one of the things that I saw candidates. We had a candidate in Illinois. His name was Anthony Clark. The person he was running against, Danny Davis, actually went door to door knocking, telling people that Anthony Clark wasn't actually running for Congress and that his ballot access that they had just signed, his petition to run for office, was invalid. Now, Anthony got to keep his ballot access despite the party challenging him on ballot access because that was considered fraud. But the legal fees bled Anthony's campaign. In West Virginia, the Democratic Party establishment supported Senate Republican Shelley Moore Capito over Paula Jean Swearingen in the general elections. Unions even endorsed Shelley Moore Capito, who is a pretty far-right GOP incumbent that has been in office way too long already. So this is part of the reason that we need people running, which I think a lot of us understand. But what I'm trying to say here is with 70% of races uncontested across the country, 70%, there is a hell of an opportunity. People aren't given a choice. No wonder they didn't show up for the presidential election. If the only person you have on the ballot to even tick a ballot box for is the presidential election, you have one milquetoast, neoliberal, right-leaning candidate, genocidal warmonger against another who is a fascist, nationalistic, authoritarian. You might just stay home. You don't have anyone on the state ballot to vote for. There's no grassroots organizing whatsoever. And yeah, this contributed to where we are, but this is also a sign that there is tremendous opportunity. If 70% of seats are uncontested, that means 70% of seats are up for grabs. Now, I want to show you guys another slide here from the Dispatch. Another article. It's like I'm doing a PowerPoint. How the Democratic Party abandoned rural voters. And there's something important I want you guys to understand here. And it's right here. And what this is talking about is how rural voters are saying, we don't have a choice in damn elections, and we want a choice. Give us a choice. Where's the Democratic Party? Of the 3,244 counties in the U.S., slightly more than 300 of them now have active and vigorous Democratic Party committees, according to Cody Lonning of the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative. Most of those can be found in big cities and wealthy suburbs. So what was I just telling you about? Abandonment of the 50-state strategy for wealthy suburbs and wealthy districts. More than 1,000 counties have no structure whatsoever, no meetings, no board, often no candidates, and some not even showing a list of listed contact person. The decay in Arizona is entirely typical. This year's presidential election may play out in the same urban-rural divide for Democrats, but the future could be different if the party is willing to course correct. Now, this is pretty astounding. It's pretty astounding that out of only 10% of counties in the entire country have Democratic Party, even have a county office. And the Kamala Harris campaign got $1 billion you think they could establish and help establish local offices and donate to state parties, which is something that, yes, a federal incumbent can do, or a federal somebody running for a presidential race can do. You think that all these political action committees that take in hundreds of millions of dollars for the Democratic Party every year could donate to state parties. And one of the crazy things is the Democratic Party came out and they were like, we're so excited. We're going to reignite the 50-state strategy. And this was in the beginning of 2024. So this was before this article came out. And they said, we'll be sending 2.5 million for the 50 states across the country to divide up. 2.5 million for all 50 states, when the party brought in almost $1 trillion this year. Almost $1 trillion. Almost $1 billion. More than $1 billion. Not a trillion. Excuse me. Over a period of time, probably over the last decade, yeah. But over the last year, it was more than $1 billion for the party itself. More than $1 billion for Kamala Harris's campaign alone. You would think that they could give state parties more than 2.5 million to organize, and that 70% of the seats across the country, most of them GOP seats, were not uncontested. Let me show you guys one other thing. Now, a lot of these states that have been abandoned were once blue states. So, Alabama was a blue state once upon a time, until you see here in this graph. And what this is showing is that in the early 2000s, all of these states flipped red. 17 states in the country that were once deeply blue flipped red. And that is not because all of a sudden sentiment completely changed across the country, even though that was part of it. It was because the Democratic Party stopped investing in states. In Georgia in 2003, they had the House, the gubernatorialship, the Senate there. So they had the state house and the governorship in Georgia in 2002 and 2003. In Kentucky, we've almost always had Democratic governors. We had the largest, we had the most diverse Democratic Party state house. We passed the first LGBTQ protections across the country. We also, we had what was called the Bitch Caucus. They were amazing. They wrote the Violence Against Women's Act. Several of them were Black women. We had the most women in any state house in the country. And now we're a red state. Even though we've had traditionally Democratic governors, it's because the state was abandoned. It's because the party became feckless. It's because they stopped giving a shit about us and they stopped even showing up, just like the criticisms of Hillary Clinton's campaign. They don't show up and they don't do anything for us. Look at North Carolina all the way up until 2012. West Virginia until 2017. The Democratic Party has handed over the entire country. But what's a bit exciting about this is that, hold up, I'm having, this is odd. There we go. It wouldn't flip off for me for a moment. I was frozen. This is an opportunity. This isn't just an analysis and a critique of the Democratic Party. This is saying that we can make waves, but we can't make waves within the Democratic Party. People need to run independent or third party, and I've showed you the barriers of what it is like to run independent. Or to run third party, excuse me. There are barriers to running third party. That is one reason that Bernie Sanders suggested running independent. It makes sense. I have plenty to criticize him for. I do think he sheep herds people back into the Democratic Party, but on this one specific point, it is not untrue. Let me show you one more story when it comes to this, and we'll talk a little bit about Dan Osborne too. Well, I'll just tell you about Dan Osborne. Dan Osborne ran in Omaha, Nebraska. He got 46.5% of the vote in a U.S. Senate race against an entrenched Republican in a fairly red state on a pretty damn progressive platform. So that shows you he almost won. He almost won. If he had just a little bit more push and just a little bit more voter outreach, he would have been there. There's opportunity. 46.5% of the vote as an independent. And I'll tell you what, other than that, there was no Democrat on this ticket. There wasn't even a Democrat running for this U.S. Senate seat in Nebraska because they don't care about us. But Dan Osborne, he decided to take up the challenge. He started a PAC. He ran as independent, 46.5% of the vote. So he almost got there. Let's take a look at Nevada. What happened in Nevada? So what happened in Nevada? This was a couple of years ago. But in Nevada Democrats ousted an entire slate of Democratic socialists who took over the state party in 2020. So a bunch of DSA progressives or just progressives that don't take corporate PAC money, that were outside of the Democratic Party, that were running as insurgent candidates, overtook the state house. What happened is Nevada Democrats have ousted a slate of Democratic socialists who took over the state party 2 years ago, ending a troubled reign. Oh, I love NBC's wording there. Marked by divisions and infighting. Judith Whitmer was booted as chair in a vote Saturday with a new slate headed by State Assemblywoman Danielle Moreno, assuming control of the party. So, one thing that this article doesn't tell you is that Democratic Party State and National, the National Committee, the Democratic Party National Committee, defunded Nebraska State Party when DSA candidates won, when they overtook the party, when they won a ton of seats in the state house. Why? Because they're there, the Democratic Party is there to uphold the machine, not support us. So it's not possible, and even though Bernie there suggests, well, you could run as a progressive under the party, but you could also run independent. Running as a progressive under the party can lead to you being co-opted, being ousted like Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush were, challenged by, centimillionaires and by AIPAC and knocked off the ballot. Running as a progressive Democrat is a failed strategy. It's not going to work. He's right about running independent, but he did fail to mention that some parties already exist, like the Green Party. Now, support for political third parties in the United States is about 60%. And that's in line with the fact that about 60% of Americans are registered as Democrats. Registered as independents, not registered as Democrats. So nearly 2/3 of the country are registered as and identify as independents at this point. So if you're running as an independent, think about that. Most Americans consider themselves independent. You are going to resonate with the majority of the country. So I also wanted to take a look at a map of, just to give people an idea of where you can start, since this is what we're talking about, what you can actually do Here is the Green Party map of states listed, and you can find it on their website, of states listed that have state ballot access. And as you can see, there's a handful of states that don't. About 10 states don't, but the rest of the states do. And I commend the Green Party for getting there. Now, there is varying amounts of organizing on the ground and support to run in races as a Green Party candidate, but that is an option for people. But in these seats, as I had told you before, building a third party from scratch takes work. This has taken the Green Party 20 years to get to this point. It's taken them 20 years to build up to be able to have this many states. They did not do it overnight. So when you see someone put up a website and I want to remind people, the DSA and Working Families Party are apparatuses of the Democratic Party for the most part. DSA sometimes runs good candidates. Working Families Party is absolutely just a wing of the Democratic Party. They are not their own party. I think they may have registration still in a couple of states, if I'm not mistaken, but they are not a robust party. Most states you can't even run as a Working Party's candidate. And most of the time, Working Families Party candidate, and most of the time what they do is they support Democrats, sometimes even corporate Democrats, a lot of corporate Democrats sometimes for office. But starting a third party from scratch is hard work. So when you see people share something, and I'm not trying to deflate movements, but saying we're starting a party, give us money, help us donate, but they're not talking about party access rules. They're not talking about what it's going to take to build. They're not talking about building a movement by running candidates and building locally. Then be concerned, maybe go check it out, but be concerned. But also, this entire apparatus, these outrageous ballot access rules for state parties to even start, that's the point. That's the point. The point is to keep people off ballots, to limit our choices. And the Democratic Party has done their fair amount to limit our choices, a whole hell of a lot, by not even running people, by leaving more than half of the seats in the country uncontested, even in states like Kentucky, which were once deeply blue. It is not a red state. A lot of these states, Kentucky, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, are not necessarily, West Virginia, even Alabama, are not necessarily deep red states. That's a mythology that they tell you based on just presidential election outcomes in order to say these people are worthless. It's not worth organizing there. But you saw the graphic. So what are we going to do about it? First, I think that people can start political action committees. That's one way that you can bring donations in to support, train candidates, donate to candidates. Then run independent in places that you can. In places you can run third party. If there is a third party there, minor or major, run under that ticket. That's awesome. But in states where there's not, or if you just want to run independent, you can do it. A lot of the time, ballot access is easier. Sometimes you need less signatures. Sometimes the filing fees are even less. And one of the most awesome things is Democrats underestimate independent candidates. They take for granted that it's going to be a failure. And so those candidates can slide under the radar without the Democratic Party or Republican Party sabotage, and sometimes take them by surprise. So maybe people should try it out. Run independent, start organizations to support candidates, build that grassroots initiative, because a third party isn't going, or support a third party that already exists, because a third party is not going to magically crop up out of thin air. It takes years and years to build. On that, Bernie was right. Whether or not he starts to sheep herd people back into the Democratic Party, I wouldn't be surprised. But he is right on this point. Don't wait. Their whole point is to make us wait. So why wait? Run independent now. Anybody can, anywhere. All you got to do is register, get ballot access, and then you go all the way to the general. You don't even have to deal with a primary. And you can build an entire grassroots movement. Imagine 10 independent candidates, 15 independent candidates win in a state house. Imagine what pressure and presence that would have in a state house, in a state that has gone deeply red, that has minority representation because it has been abandoned by the Democratic Party, if 15 members of the state house there were independent. They would have sway on legislation, policy, real action, real effect. I also want to let you guys know that Tina Desiree Berg from Status Coup was doing on the ground live coverage from the Defeat the Oligarchy rally yesterday, the one where you saw the clip from Bernie Sanders. She talked to all kinds of people on the ground. People are pissed. People are angry. They had a lot to say. Go check out our live coverage on Status Coup. We're covering the rallies. We're covering the heat. We're covering the uprising in this country, and hopefully we'll be covering a whole hell of a lot of independent and third-party candidate races coming up in the next electoral cycle. But please check out Status Coup. Check out Tina's latest work on Status Coup, and like, subscribe, donate to Status Coup at info.com, and have a great day. Thank you so much.